how does this kind of terroristic menace work? What does it accomplish? Why is this a political tactic? Sometimes it's easier to see in other time periods or in other time places than it is to see in our own. So consider this. It is from our country, but it's from a long time ago, 1939. 1939, a congressional committee took testimony, very high-profile testimony, got a lot of attention at the time. They took testimony from one of the most famous Army generals in the United States. His name was General George Van Horn Moseley. Until not long before this committee testimony, General George Van Horn Moseley had been the Deputy Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. He's a very, very, very senior person in the United States military. Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army. He goes before the Congress and he testifies in 1939 that he believed there were more than 6 million communists in the United States of America, and more than 90% of them had to be Jews. By then, General Moseley had put himself forward to the leading fascist groups in America as a potential military dictator for the United States, which is what they were working for and which is what he thought we needed in this country. And why would we need a dictator instead of our democracy? Well, General Moseley told the Congress in 1939, quote, "The first thing I would do if I was in the White House, gentlemen, I would issue an order immediately discharging every communist now in the government of the United States." He told Congress, quote, "I believe in watching our breed in America very carefully." He told Congress that Hitler in Germany had, quote, "solved the racial problem." By 1939, General Moseley was publicly advocating, a speaking tour, publicly advocating for the sterilization of all Jewish immigrants in America. This man had been Deputy Chief of Staff of the United States Army. 1939. The following year, in 1940, 17 members of a group called the Christian Front were arrested and put on trial for sedition. They had stolen U.S. military weapons. They had stockpiled quite a lot of bombs for a plot to overthrow the U.S. government by force. Again, it was huge news in the country at the time. The Christian Front planned to kick it off by murdering congressmen, particularly Jewish congressmen, and then they planned to bomb Jewish and left-wing sites in New York City, which they hoped would set off some kind of communist, violent reaction. They expected there would be an ensuing emergency. There'd be enough tumult and violence in the streets that there would be a state of emergency. It would result in at least a temporary military takeover of the civilian functions of government, and that would put them in a position to install a military dictatorship in the United States. They thought if you could just lump together the Jews and the communists, well, that would sound so bad and so scary to the whole rest of the country, it would justify almost anything in response. It would justify throwing out our whole system of government on basically an emergency basis to stop this terrible threat, and then they could get rid of democracy once and for all, put somebody in there who would run things more along the lines of the leaders they admired in Europe. Republican Congressman Hamilton Fish of New York famously went to Germany in the eve of World War II, the eve of the United States getting involved in World War II. He spent considerable time with the Nazi government in Berlin, including flying around Europe on the private airplane of the Nazi foreign minister. He let a high-level Nazi agent use his congressional office in Washington to run a huge operation that circulated pro-German propaganda throughout the United States. Congressman Hamilton Fish didn't display any public anti-Semitism, but he did contribute to a glowing book-length assessment in 1933 about how Hitler and the Nazis had done the world a huge favor by striking a blow against communism. Because sure, anything's justified against communism, am I right? If there's some kind of, existential threat that not only lurks in the world, but it's coming from here at home, coming from within somehow, well, you'd do almost anything to stop it, right? You'd agree to do things you'd never otherwise agree to because it's an emergency. If you get people exercised enough about the threat, if you use just the right words, you get people exercised enough about the threat and who's to blame for the threat, and frankly, who's to blame for everything. It doesn't have to be rational. You just get people emotionally exercised enough about it, get people afraid enough about it, and they're liable to do things they would never otherwise agree to. I have this new book out called Prequel, An American Fight Against Fascism, that in part tells the story of Mosley and Hamilton Fish and the Christian Front, because I wanted to try to tell the story right now of how these kinds of tactics have worked here in the United States in the past, not just abroad, but here. There were a surprisingly large number of Americans here who wanted fascism here in the lead up to World War II. Because the same menacing rhetoric and propaganda and scapegoating about Jews, the same menacing propaganda about how the only threat in the world was on the left and we needed to abandon all restraint, all weakness in crushing the internal enemies. That rhetoric, that propaganda, that language, that political tactic didn't just work in the countries that turned into dictatorships in the 1930s. That political tactic worked on a lot of Americans here just as well as it worked abroad. Because it's an effective political tactic. And, you know, nobody is a Nazi but a Nazi. Nobody is Hitler but Hitler. Nobody is Mussolini but Mussolini, right? There's no point in making, and there's no cause to make any sort of modern analogy to the fascist dictatorships of the 1930s. But we are having this weird moment in American news and politics right now where half the country is shouting about how the Republican presidential nominee keeps quoting those dictators. He keeps saying the kinds of things, the exact kind of things that Hitler and Mussolini said as they ascended to and consolidated power. And you see the names of those dictators, and you see the discussion of that period in history all over the news right now because he is saying those things. He is effectively quoting Mussolini and Hitler in some of their most effective propagandistic tactics. But pointing out that he's saying Hitler-esque and Mussolini-esque things turns out to not be enough to make him stop saying those things. He doesn't mind being compared to those people. Why is he willing to keep saying those things, despite everybody pointing out, hey, that's what Hitler said, hey, that's what Mussolini said, you don't want to be a Hitler or a Mussolini, do you? Why is it not enough to stop him from using those tactics, from saying those things, from trying to make people think about the world that way? It's not enough because those things work for him. There is a reason that it is, you know, it's dictators and authoritarians who talk about their internal enemies being vermin who have to be rooted out or exterminated. There's a reason that it's dictators and authoritarians who talk about immigrants poisoning the blood of the country. There's a reason they do it, which is that it works on people. It makes people want to put a strong man in charge, to break all the rules and destroy those very scary enemies, right? Iron fist. There's been all this discussion, I know, in the past few days about the former president, the Republican presidential frontrunner, playing this fascist dictator greatest hits mixtape, right? I do want to be a dictator. I will root out the vermin amongst us, the Marxist communist vermin. You know, immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. There's been a lot of discussion about that in recent days, and there should be. But pointing at it and saying, that sounds really dictator-y, isn't enough. Right? Why is it that even after everybody pointed out that those were Hitler-esque and Mussolini-esque statements, he kept doing them? Right? These are things he has tried out in the last few weeks. He is now repeating them. He is putting them in writing. He is making them part of his regular speeches. Why is he doing that? Because these things are getting a good response. A good response, a response that he likes. Not just the outrage of his critics, which he likes, but the pleasure and support of the people who like him the most. In a Des Moines Register poll this weekend, this is the Des Moines Register NBC News Mediacom Iowa poll this weekend, that poll asked Iowa Republicans about Trump's recent statements along these lines. The poll asked whether these comments from Trump would make you more or less likely to support him, Iowa Republican. And the answers are worth paying attention to. On his claim that immigrants are poisoning the blood of America, which is straight out of Mein Kampf. On the vermin in the United States that needs to be rooted out, which comes straight out of the playbook of Mussolini and Hitler. even on his pledge to build giant camps to hold millions of people in this country. On those statements, Iowa Republican voters say, as of this weekend, that those statements from Trump make them more likely to vote for him, not less. These things that Trump is saying right now, they sound familiar, not just because he's going for shock value, not just because he's going for the transgressive thrill of saying things that famous dictators and genocidal maniacs have said in the past. The reason these things sound familiar and he started to repeat them and started to make them part of his regular repertoire is because this stuff works. There's a reason Hitler and Mussolini said this stuff too. It worked then. It works now. It has worked abroad all over the world. And yes, it has worked here too. More than we like to remember, which is why I wrote this book this year. It's not just a bad and dangerous thing he's doing that you can stop him from doing by pointing out that it's bad and dangerous. This kind of rhetoric, trying to turn Americans not just against each other, but to the idea that some people among us are so dangerous that they must be exterminated, that some threats to us justify terminating the Constitution, that justify being a dictator, if only for a day. This is the sort of thing that has a political point. It is designed to make you believe that a democratic system with checks and balances and the constraint of the rule of law and elections where people are voted out sometimes and divided power within government, those things are not up to stopping these terrible evils that threaten us, the terrible threat that some people among us pose to the rest of us. This stuff is tactically efficient. It's designed to make us think that we need a strong man. We need a tough man. We don't need a legal system and all its constraints. We don't need a court system. We don't really need a political process. We don't need politicians. We don't need Congress. We need strength, will, action, revenge, broken rules, maybe even violence. These statements are not just supposed to shock you. They're supposed to work on you, to make you believe we need something new and extreme to deal with our terrible problems, if only for a little while, maybe just a temporary dictatorship. And these tactics have a terrible history of working really well in other countries and, yes, here in our past. Once you realize that it is a political tactic, well, then how do you stop it from working? If it has worked well in the past, what have we learned from the past about how to stop it from working so well again? Well, it's not rocket science, but it does take work, and right now. I mean, I think it should hopefully go without saying that one thing that needs to be done is to refuse personally, individually, all of us, to play any part in any politics that depends on you thinking of your political opponents as monsters. To refuse to participate in any politics that depends on any group in society being seen as a menace, as something that needs to be eliminated or rooted out. It means standing up for any group that is being targeted that way. And yes, there is a role for regular citizens in that. Thank you to the Daphne, Alabama church that offered its church facilities to the local synagogue down the road that had to flee in the face of that bomb threat before its own Saturday services this weekend. There's a space there for regular people, but there's also a place for law enforcement. As I said, the Massachusetts Attorney General is here next. It also means that the legal system has to be both used and defended, right? The legal system needs to play a role in prosecuting crimes, upholding the idea that the rule of law still applies, and it needs to be protected from political pressure and intimidation. It also means we need to both use and defend the political system that we do have, that the anti-democratic forces among us want us to abandon. When they attack not just election results, but election workers, that is part of breaking the small d democratic system, which of course makes it easier for us all to imagine throwing it away.